Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share Spellbinders Clubs for September. Specifically, I'm going to share the die of the month as well as the large die of the month. This here is the die of the month. It is called Autumn Scarecrow. And then we have the large die of the month, which is the Picture Perfect Autumn. So I'm going to use mainly these die sets. I've already done a part 1 of this, and in that video I use the glimmer plate of the month, the stencil of the month, the clear stamp of the month, as well as the 3D embossing folder. So if you want to see those being used, I will link to that video at the end of this one. So the first thing I'm going to do is use that Autumn Scarecrow die. I did all my die cutting off screen and I have everything in my medium craft stacks. I love using these for organizing my projects, having everything ready to go. Before I start assembling my die cuts, I do want to do some ink blending on them, give them some natural visual dimension. And I also want to do an ink blended background for my cards. So I have some Hammermill cardstock here. I have it on my Altenew sticky mat. It's great for holding it in place while I'm doing that ink blending. I'm using some large Spellbinders ink blending brushes. And for that background, I used crushed olive as well as Stormy Sky. It worked perfectly for that background to get the nice leafy green color or grass green color for the bottom, and then the sky color for the top. I was going to deepen some of the blue in some areas, but after I was done, I liked it the way it was, and I didn't want to really do too much. So you don't have to do the ink blending for your die cuts, and sometimes I don't because either I'm not in the mood or that's not the look I'm going for. But for these cards, I wanted to add that ink blending. I wanted to have that visual dimension with the shading around the outside. So I'm going to go through my die cuts and ink blend around them. For the pumpkins and the orange die cut pieces that I have, the cardstock that I'm using here is Persimmon, and for the majority of my die cuts, they are all Spellbinders cardstocks. And the ink that I used for the ink blending is Rusty Hinge Distress ink. So all of the inks that I'm using for the ink blending is Distress inks. I did that same Stormy Sky on the little blue jean overalls as well as the pocket. And now we're taking out all of our yellow die cuts. These ones were die cut out of Beeswax Spellbinders cardstock. I'm doing the ink blending for the sunflowers in carved pumpkin, just adding some nice orange in the center. I wanted to tie it in with the orange pumpkins. Now I have die cut a ton of pieces from each of these die sets. I know that I'm likely not going to be using all of them in each card, so I'm going to have some extra ones. I just save them in a Ziploc bag for the next time I'm crafting. I always like to have more die cuts than I need when I'm creating so that I don't have to stop and do some die cutting in the middle of a project. For the center of these flowers, I'm using Hickory Smoke just to give a nice dark center, but I don't want it to be so dark that it's black. Now I'm doing all Distress ink blending here, and if you did see part 1 of my Spellbinders Clubs video, I did use Distress inks, but I also used some Cloud9 interference inks. I love them. I've done many videos on them. They would be a great addition to this ink blending to add just a touch of shimmer to some of the die cuts. So if you wanted to, you absolutely could add them in here. I didn't, just to keep these a little bit more simple, because I knew there was going to be a lot of ink blending. I knew that I had a lot of die cuts, and I didn't want to get too over the top. But I do think for some of the pieces in the cards, it would be a nice addition. So that's an additional idea if you wanted to add just a touch of shimmer. So for my sunflower stems, they were cut out of Peridot cardstock, and I used the crushed olive to do that ink blending. I have my little signs here for the pumpkin patch, and I'm doing that die cutting or that ink blending with frayed burlap. I'm also using that frayed burlap for the hair as well as the straw that's going to come out of his arms, and then just a touch of that around his face. I don't want his face to look dirty, but I don't think it would look right if it was pristine with no ink blending either. So putting a little bit around the outside with a light hand kind of ties that all in together. For the rest of the greenery here, these are cut out of Fern cardstock, and I'll be doing the ink blending on these with forest moss. You can see how handy it comes in to have my Altenew sticky mat. It really holds those pieces in place. Even the small ones, it doesn't necessarily hold them completely, but it holds it enough to do ink blending. And I also always have a damp microfiber cloth to clean off my mat in between ink blending different colors, so I'm not contaminating anything. Now that I'm done all of my ink blending, I'm ready to start assembly. So behind the Scarecrow's nose and eyes, I just have some scraps of cardstock that I'm just gluing behind there. I'm using Persimmon for the nose and just some black cardstock to go behind the eyes. You can make them any color you want, but that's the easiest way to color them. Here's one piece that I forgot to actually do a little bit of ink blending on, which is the shirt, and it looked a little bit weird being pristine. So I just used whatever frayed burlap ink was left on that brush and just gave it a little bit of shading around the outside. I also think this would look really great if you used some pens or whatnot and gave it a plaid. I think that would look great as well. So I went and I glued the overalls onto the shirt and then glued them on the stand, and I will realize in a minute that I have it glued onto the stand wrong. So I will fix it if you see that it's done wrong and it's bothering you right now. It does get noticed and it does get fixed. While I'm waiting for the head and the overalls to dry, or at least start setting a little bit, I added a little bit of glue to the top of the stalks of the sunflowers and then put the sunflowers over them. When I cut my sunflowers out, as well as everything else, I was using mostly scraps first. So I have a bunch of different colors for my sunflowers. I also like it better that way. It gives it a little bit more variety, and I like the look of it a lot better. Next, I'm going to glue the handkerchief beneath the chin, and then I'm going to start gluing in the straw pieces for the hands. And this is where I realized that I glued the stand on wrong. And the funny thing is when I glued it on wrong, I'm like, that's kind of weird that they would have a stand like this for the bottom of a car. Whatever, my brain was clearly not thinking right when I was doing it. And I figured I'd leave it in there because I actually just think it's funny. And I know that I'm not the only one that glues things wrong or when they're gluing things together. That's the nice part about liquid glue, is it gives you a little bit of forgiveness, a little bit of wiggle room to fix things, unless it's completely set when you notice, but most of the time I notice halfway through. So then I can glue the rest of those straw pieces to the sleeves as well as the legs for the hands and the feet. I like to put an acrylic block over top of my things while they're setting. Just keeps everything nice and flat, keeps it all in place, and frees up my hands to keep on working. While the Scarecrow is drying, I put the stems on the pumpkins, and then I put the signs on the little stem or the stick that they go on. And you can see that when I'm assembling, I'm kind of going all around and assembling little bits of different things. I don't necessarily completely assemble something all at once and then move on. I do it in different stages and let each of those stages dry. Next, I put the brim or the band on the hat as well as the buckle, and then I'm going to put the beak for the crow as well as the eye. Now that eye is tiny, so it's really handy to have a pair of reverse tweezers to hold that while you put the glue on them and then place it, and then we can set that aside under the acrylic block for that to dry. The glue is set enough on the Scarecrow hat that I can put that on him and have that start to set. So now that all the rest of the die cut pieces are assembled, I can trim down my background, and I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, and I can glue it to my card base. I'm just using white card bases for all of the cards in this video. I like the look of a white rim around it. Sometimes I will do an extra mat behind my ink blended background, but for this one I wanted to have as much space as possible for those die cuts to go, so I didn't do that. I just cut my ink blended background down just a little bit so that I could see the white card base. If you don't want to see the white card base, you could leave that ink blended background the full size and have no white rim around it. I like the look of it. So I was going to put the star or the sunflowers here behind the sign or behind the Scarecrow, but once I started placing it, I was losing some of that ink blended background, and for me it was looking a little bit too crowded. It's one of those things that it's nice to be able to customize it and do what you like and what's going to work for you. And other days it might have been fine with that behind it, but for the day that I was assembling this, I didn't really like the look of it. By having an acrylic block on something to hold it flat while it's drying, it makes it really easy to test your layout, put things where you think you're wanting them to go, and see if it's going to work for you. I also like to put things kind of hanging off my card, and then I will trim them off. So my Scarecrow, the one arm goes off, and I'm just going to trim that flush with the edge of the card. But I like the fact that it extends beyond my ink blended background. It looks a little bit more interesting that way. After I glued my pumpkins down, I can start gluing down the vines as well as the little leaves. The leaves and the vines are great for just filling in different areas and just giving it a more natural look. Now that pumpkin that's on the bottom there that looks like a jack-o'-lantern, you could also use that as a head for the Scarecrow. And in fact, on the packaging, that's what they use. So it gives you dual duty. You have two different choices of the heads for the Scarecrow, or you can add that jack-o'-lantern in amongst the pumpkins like I have done here. Once I have all my leaves down and my vines down as well, I'm going to add the crow, and I'm just putting him on top of one of the pumpkins. You could also put him on top of the sign. You could put him on top of the Scarecrow's head. You could put him on top of one of the sticks that his arms are on. So you have a lot of options there. There's also some bats in this die set. You could have those flying in the air as well. I chose not to for this card, but it's definitely an option. And I love the fact that there are so many different things in these sets. So you have a lot of options with them and a lot of different ways that you can go. To add some extra texture to this card, I'm just using a little bit of glossy accents. I did a little bit on the crow's eye. I'm going to do it inside the jack-o'-lantern, and off screen I did a little bit in the Scarecrow's eyes as well. So it just adds a space that has some shine and some shimmer to it. For my second card, we're going to create the Picture Perfect Autumn picture. So I've got all my pieces die cut as well. I'm going to do some hills in the background with some Fern and some Peridot cardstock. This card is going to be a vertical card, so my green cardstock was a little bit too big. Originally I cut it down to be 4 1/4 inches. Once I have my background done, I will cut it down even more, so it's 4 inches by 5 1/4. I can cut those down. Now my Fern piece here is going to go behind that Peridot piece, so it doesn't need to be as long as it's going to be in for the card. I can have it up a little bit more and have the edge of that piece of cardstock hiding behind the light green one there. So you don't have to make it completely perfect, and make sure that it's fitting the right dimensions for the card, as long as it looks good behind the other hill. For my driveway here, there are 2 different dies to use in this set. I put the barn kind of how I figured it was going to be on my card and placed those dies that way. For me, that was the easiest way to see how it was going to look right. These die, you can do it a few different ways with these dies. I wanted the driveway kind of going off to the side of the card. On the picture on the die set, it goes right to the center bottom of the card. And with that center of the bottom of the card, that's how those fence pieces fit properly. So for the way that I have it cut, they're really not going to work properly, which is totally fine. I didn't have my heart set on the fence, but trying to make them fit, they just looked completely wrong. So rather than fight with it or have it exactly the same way as it was on the front of the card, I decided to just skip them all together. I'll save them for a future card. I'm sure they'll get used at some point. So I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here that I'm going to use for my background. Now I already have my hills die cut, but I did want to do some ink blending for the sky. So for my sun there, I'm using some squeezed lemonade, and for the rest of the sky, I'm using some Stormy Sky, but I'm going to pull in some saltwater taffy. This is kind of a corally color, and in my head, this is more of a sunrise scene. So I thought adding the little corally pinky color in the sky for the sunrise looked pretty. Now, the one thing I didn't do any ink blending on was the rolling hills here, and I intentionally didn't do it because I liked the look when I was putting everything together of having it without the ink blending. But with my card together, I wish I had done a little bit of ink blending on the bottom of that base. So if you want to do some ink blending, it's much easier to do it before everything is assembled, but you don't necessarily have to. Like I said, when I was putting the card together, when I was doing my ink blending, I liked the look of it without, but at the end, I wish I had done it. So neither is right or wrong, it's just personal preference. So with my background done here, I can do my ink blending on my die cuts. Once again, I have the rest of them all completely done, sitting in a medium craft stacks on the side. I'm going to do them bit by bit. So I have some fog cardstock here that I used to die cut that driveway, and I'm going to use some Hickory Smoke Distress ink just to add a little bit of shading to the end of it. For this one, it probably would have made more logical sense if it was on the narrower part of it. It doesn't matter. For my clouds, I'm just doing a really light coat on the bottom of the clouds for some shading. And then I'm going to go and do some of the tree pieces. I have them die cut out of a bunch of different colors of cardstock. So we have some Beeswax cardstock, some Peridot, some Persimmon, and then I also have some Sunkissed as well. So I love to have a bunch of different choices for when I'm assembling. I do find out later when I'm doing the assembling that I don't have quite enough of the tree pieces. So I do off screen do a little bit more die cutting, and then I ink blend them off screen as well. For my Persimmon cardstock here, I'm ink blending with the Rusty Hinge Distress Pad. I'm only doing a little bit of ink blending on the bottom part, and then same for the pumpkins. I'm only doing a little bit on the bottom part of those pumpkins. I'm also doing just a tiny little bit at the bottom of the sentiment strip. This one comes with that die set. I didn't want to add a ton of ink blending with it, so I just did a tiny little bit at the bottom with whatever was left on my brush. For my next, or my darker colored yellow die cuts, I'm using the carved pumpkin. And then for my Peridot ones, I'm using some crushed olive distress ink. For my lighter yellow die cut pieces, these are ones were done out of the Beeswax cardstock. These are being ink blended with squeezed lemonade. It's not very dark compared to the yellow cardstock. You could do something a little bit darker, but for just this, I didn't want to go grab another additional pad. I figured I was using enough pads with this as it is. So I just went and made do with what I already had on my desk. Now, just like my last card, I have a lot of pieces die cut here, more than I'm going to be using on this card. What I end up doing is saving the extra pieces and creating a third card. When starting this, I knew I wanted to do 2 cards, and I had a kind of plan B to do a third card because I had a feeling which die cuts weren't going to go or which ones I wasn't going to like, and I ended up being right in that feeling. So I will use them for the third card. So once again, they don't go to waste. They will get used up. For my greenery and leaves here, the ones that were die cut out of the Peridot cardstock, I am doing the ink blending with some crushed olive. And for the ones die cut out of Fern cardstock, I did my ink blending with forest moss. Now that most of the ink blending is done, we can start our assembly. So for the barn, it is cut out of crimson cardstock. I didn't do any ink blending here because I didn't think it was really that necessary, and I like the look of a bright, nicely new and fresh painted barn here. I did my trim with just white cardstock, but for the roof, I used some brushed silver cardstock from the treasured silver, or the silver treasured cardstock packs from Spellbinders. I love the look of that red barn with the silver roof on it. So that was absolutely perfect. And for the final card, it's neat to see that metallic finish on it. It's very subtle because it's not shiny. It's just the brushed background, but it looks really cool. Now I can glue on my barn doors as well as the little window or hayloft door. Now, I actually grew up on a farm. I grew up on a hobby farm. My parents still live there, and my dad raises llamas as well as my brother. So this kind of felt a little bit like home to me, or like where I grew up, a little bit, not totally, but a little bit. So I loved doing this card. I thought it was really, really fun to do kind of a fall background with the sunflowers as well as the pumpkins. Only thing that would have made it truly like the place I grew up is if we had some llama die cuts to put in the field or whatnot. But I love the look of this barn with this fall background. I think it looks really, really cool. And something fun and unique and just a little bit different for some fall cards. The centers of those sunflower cards were die cut out of graphite cardstock, which is a really dark gray, not totally black, but not too light either. And I love those as the center. My pumpkins there, they have a base to them that does all the stems. So all you need to do is just put some glue on that and then attach the correct pumpkin sizes. And I like the look of it with all of those stems on there. You could cut that background in parts if you wanted to have them in a different arrangement or change it up. It would totally work that way. But for what I was creating, this worked well enough. For the trees, there is some brown cardstock that I just used from my scraps for the base of the trees. And then all the little leaf clumps, I'm going to use different colors and glue them, some behind and some in front of those trees. I like the look of seeing some of the branches and having some of them hidden behind. This is where I realized that I didn't have enough pieces cut out. So I'll assemble a couple of them and then I will do some die cutting off screen and then assemble those. I love the look of these trees with the different colors on them. Now I'm doing a fall look here because of the time of year that I'm creating this, because of some of the different things in this die set, but I think this would create a really cool winter and spring card as well. For the winter, you could just omit any of these leaf pieces and just have some bare trees, do a lot of whites and grays, and then have a bright red barn in there. And I think that would look really, really fun and really different and neat. Just a different way to use it and a way to get more use out of it. And then for the spring, you could have all spring colors. Not necessarily have pumpkins because that's more of a fall thing. But I think it would be a fun way, again, to get more use out of this die set and be able to use it throughout the year. And I know farmers do their work throughout the year at all seasons. So I think they'd be appropriate as cards throughout the year. So here is the third tree that I'm creating. Once again, using several different shades of oranges, greens, and yellows, and I love the look of them all together. Another thing that you could do here is you could just use, say, some watercolor cardstock, use a bunch of different colored, say, distress reinkers, or using some Magical's pigment powders and create a background, and then die cut that where you have each clump with a bunch of different fall colors on them. That would look fantastic as well. So you've got a lot of options with this. With those ones all put together, I put my acrylic block on there, let them dry, and we're ready to start assembling. So for my hills, I'm going to glue the darker green one behind the lighter green one, then place that on the front of the card. This die set does have a sun, and I kept going back and forth as to whether I wanted to use it or not. And really, with that ink blended background, you don't need it at all. But because I already had it die cut, I figured I might as well add it to it. Again, personal preference. It's not totally necessary. You can add it if you want, or you could omit it if you want. But it's nice to have options and kind of know what some of those options are. Now that my background is done, I'm going to cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For most of these areas, it cuts no problem, but the one side where there was 3 layers of cardstock, it did have a little bit of a harder time, but we did get through it. Now that that is cut down, we can glue that to our base. And now I want to figure out exactly how to position that driveway so it looks properly or proper and properly proportioned for the card. So I know how I'm going to put it. I glue that down, and then I can glue my barn down and then assemble everything else around it. I want to make sure I have those things in proper placement before starting to add the trees and the pumpkins. Now I'm going to add some trees beside and behind the barn and some in front. So by using liquid glue, I can make sure that I have enough wiggle room to lift something up and tuck it behind if it needs to go there. I'm also trying to be mindful of where I have the sun behind there, and I don't want to completely cover that as well. I am putting some of the trees off the outside of my card. Once my glue has set enough, I will take my scissors and I will trim that down. But again, I don't want to cover too much of my card, and I always like having things hanging off a little bit. I think it makes it look like a snapshot of a real picture rather than having everything within frame. With those trees in place, I can assemble and put my pumpkins down, and then I can add my sentiment to the bottom of the card. Now, to be honest, I don't think it misses the fences at all by the driveway. I don't think that's necessary. And I also think that it's not missing the sunflowers that were created either. You can see the sample on the packaging for this, another different layout to use, and they do use the sunflowers on that. But I love the look of this, a little bit more clean and simple with not quite as much in the foreground. My last step here, I'm adding some of those clouds to the sky. And I think these clouds would be good for the Scarecrow as well. It would be nice to add those to the sky as well. So it's nice to be able to mix and match between the two different die sets. So here is my finished card using that Picture Perfect Autumn large die of the month. And now I'm going to use up the rest of those sunflowers. Before I do that, I do have some foiled sentiments that I used for my last video, but I don't have them in the foil that I'm wanting for the card that I'm going to create. So I'm using some Aura Glimmer foil. This is gold, but it has a holographic look to it, and I think it's going to look beautiful with the different colors of the die cuts that we're having for this card. I know I want my sub-sentiment to be towards the top of the card, and I'm going to use the thanks as well as the thanks die to die cut that for the bottom of the card to go in front of my sunflowers. So I wanted to make sure I had perfect placement for that sub-sentiment, so I did cut my foil as close to the plate as I could and then taped everything in place to make sure that that wasn't going to move and shift on me. With that done and cooling, I can do my thanks. Now, if you've never done hot foiling before, you need the plate on the glimmer machine, the pretty side of the foil facing the plate, and I'm using some Hammermill cardstock. Put your plates on there, press the timer button, and once that timer goes off, then you put it through your die cutting machine. You need both the heat and the pressure to make it work properly. So for my thanks here, I did get some overfoiling. To fix that, I'm just using some Best Ever craft tape. I took some of the excess stickiness off of it with my fingers. This is a piece of tape that I've used a couple times for die cutting as well. I find for this it works best if it's not super sticky. If it's super sticky, sometimes it starts to rip the paper a little bit. Once I've taken some of that excess off that way, I can use my sand eraser. You do want to be careful with the sand eraser that you don't put it over the areas you're wanting to keep, because it does alter the finish of the foil. And I'm only doing it on the areas of the foil that's closest to what is going to be on the piece that gets die cut. Any of the overfoiling that's not on that, I don't need to worry about it. It's going to be die cut out anyways. Once I have that corrected and have the overfoiling off, I can line up my die, tape it in place to make sure it's not going to shift on me, and I can do that die cutting. When I am doing the die cutting of foiled or stamped sentiments, I definitely want to tape that die in place, make sure it doesn't shift. I also find that if I have the die facing down, so that the blade is facing down, there's less chance of it moving and shifting while I'm running it through my die cutting machine. Now I have a perfect die cut sentiment. I like the placement of my foiled sub sentiment, but I do want to trim it down a little bit so that I have an area for a mat around here. So I'm cutting this down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So I took 1/4 inch off of each of the edges. Then I'm doing a little bit of light ink blending. I'm using crushed olive here on the bottom, and then I'll use some Stormy Sky on the top. This is just going to give a background for behind those sunflowers. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's just for some color. I think it would look rather plain with just a white background. You could use colored cardstock, but I also love the look of this ink blended background. It coordinates beautifully with the other cards in this video, and it just gives it a little bit more of a visually interesting as well as a softer look when it's ink blended than using just some solid cardstock. So I'm using the large Spellbinders ink blending brushes for these as well. I find them great for doing backgrounds because they're just a little bit softer. The bristles are super soft, and you can be a little bit more gentle with this. Now, you can see that I have some white coming off of my mat. Now, when I was looking for my foil, I took a piece of Hammermill cardstock that I had done some negative foiling in white foil. Not realized it because it's really hard to see that white foil on that background. Well, that was against the sticky mat. Now, I left it in this video so I would remember to talk about this. it transferred over to my sticky mat. I did get it off. I just soaked my sticky mat into a sink with some warm soapy water. It just had some dish soap in it. And I was able to scrub it off with a cloth. I didn't use anything abrasive. But if you use white foil on white cardstock, it's very, very hard to see. And I didn't know where that extra piece of cardstock came from and used it without even thinking. And it wasn't until I took it off my mat that I realized what it was. And really, I thought it was kind of funny. So I wanted to share that as well. If you happen to get some foil on your sticky mat and don't know how to get it off, just soak it in so a sink full of warm soapy water and use a little bit of elbow grease and it will come off. Now I'm ready to glue on my sunflowers. My mat for this card was just out of that Sunkissed cardstock. And it blends perfectly with one of those with the sunflowers. So I wanted to tie in and frame it. It also coordinates nicely with that gold foil. At first I wasn't going to put stems on my sunflowers, and then they looked a little bit odd kind of floating there. So I decided to add those stems to it. I like the fact that these die cuts have the circles on both ends. So it means that you can make it so it is curving to the left or curving to the right. You can pick and choose what works best for whatever design you're working on. It gives you a little bit more opportunities again. And I just cut the circles off of the bottom pieces so that they weren't in the way behind my thanks. I'm putting everything kind of to a point, or the stems and everything to a point, and then I'm going to have my thanks sentiment go over top of it. I do want to have one of the leaves kind of go over top of the thanks, just to give it a little bit more dimension, but I will glue that die cut in place first and then adjust everything a little bit. So once that is in place, I can put my acrylic block on there to hold it and then add that last leaf. You can put as many or as few leaves in here as you want. It's entirely up to you. I try to do odd numbers when I'm doing this, but when I went to go add an extra of the lighter leaves, it looked a little bit weird. So I left it as is. I think I have 2 of the darker ones and then one of the lighter ones. Again, it's nicer to have more die cuts and find you don't need them than to have to stop and do some more die cutting. For the center of the sunflowers, they do have some little cut detail in there from doing that die cutting. You could leave it as is. I wanted to give it just a touch of sparkle, so I'm just doing dots of stickles, really tiny dots of stickles. So it's not covering the center of the flowers completely. It's just going to add a touch of sparkles on top of those die cut details. I'm going to let that completely dry, and then we still have those smaller sunflowers from the Scarecrow die set. I'm going to glue those into the center of the card. Now I have, I think, 6 of them die cut. I'm only going to use 3 of them, but I thought it was a nice addition to the center of the card, and because I have them die cut and assembled anyways, I might as well use them and just have that little die cut surprise inside. So I'm just gluing these down with my Barely Art glue. I don't think I already mentioned it in this video. I use it in a fine tip bottle because you can use it for the tiny little die cuts. You can also use it for gluing larger pieces as well. I use this for gluing pretty much everything, and I love the fact that I have that wiggle room as well as the fact that it sticks really, really well. Once those have stuck for a few moments, I'm just adding those same dots of stickles to the centers of the card just to tie that in with the sunflowers in the front. So here is our finished sunflower card. I love those foiled sentiments with it, or the foiled details with it. And then we have our Picture Perfect Autumn card and then our Scarecrow card. So if you haven't already seen part 1 of this video, here are the cards that I'm creating in that. We're using the pumpkin stencil. I'm using it with interference inks as well as just distress inks, and I love the 2 different looks that you get with it. This is the 3D embossing folder, the pumpkin patch, and all those 3 of those first cards there have that foiled sentiment, and then we have our clear stamp of the month. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.